The thunder that rolled across the prairie matched the turbulence in Elizabeth Anderson's heart as she stared at her reflection in the tarnished mirror. The wedding dress her father had purchased from a catalog back east felt like a prison sentence wrapped in lace and satin. In less than an hour, she would be Mrs. Horace Pemberton, wealthy banker, respected citizen of Willow Creek, and a man old enough to be her father. A man she did not love. Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she adjusted the veil. The small bedroom in her father's house suddenly felt suffocating. Through the window, she could see guests arriving at the church across the dusty main street of Willow Creek, Texas. The year was 1875, and at 20 years old, Elizabeth knew she was already considered dangerously close to becoming a spinster. But marrying Horace wasn't the answer. "You look beautiful, Miss Elizabeth," her maid Martha said, securing the last pearl button on the back of the dress. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, her mind racing. "Could you fetch me a glass of water, please? My throat is terribly dry." The moment Martha left, Elizabeth moved with purpose. She'd been planning this for days, ever since her father had announced the engagement, without even consulting her. From beneath the bed, she pulled out a small bundle containing a simple blouse, riding skirt, and boots. She changed quickly, stuffing the wedding dress under the covers to resemble a sleeping form. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped the small pouch of saved coins into her pocket. The back staircase creaked as she descended, but the house was mercifully empty, with everyone focused on preparations at the church. Elizabeth paused at her father's study door, guilt washing over her. On his desk, she placed the note she'd written the night before. "Father, I cannot marry a man I do not love. Please forgive me. I will write when I am settled. Elizabeth." She knew it would break his heart, but staying would break hers. Since her mother's death 3 years ago, her father had grown distant, more concerned with his business dealings than with his daughter's happiness. This marriage was meant to secure his partnership with the bank, not to secure her future. Elizabeth slipped out the back door and hurried toward the stables. The wedding was set to begin in 30 minutes, and she needed to be far away by then. As she rounded the corner of the barn, she nearly collided with a tall figure. "Whoa there," came a deep voice as strong hands steadied her. Elizabeth gasped, looking up into the face of Yates Young, the cowboy who worked at the neighboring ranch. With his sun-bronzed face, piercing blue eyes, and sandy hair that was always a bit too long, Yates was considered the most handsome man in the county and the most troublesome, according to her father. "Elizabeth?" His brow furrowed as he took in her appearance. "Aren't you supposed to be getting married right about now?" "Please," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't tell anyone you saw me." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're running away." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway, tears threatening to spill. "I can't marry him, Yates. I just can't." For a moment, Yates said nothing, and Elizabeth feared he would march her straight back to the house. They had known each other for years, had even shared a cautious friendship despite her father's disapproval. But she had no right to expect his help in this. To her surprise, he gave a short nod. "Where are you headed?" "The train station in Carson City." "There's a train leaving for San Francisco in 2 hours. Yates ran a hand through his hair, glancing back toward the town. "That's 30 miles, and your father will have men searching the roads within the hour." He looked at her again, decision made. "Take my horse. He's faster than anything in your father's stable." Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you help me?" A smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe I don't think anybody should be forced to marry someone they don't want to. Or maybe I just enjoy causing trouble for your father." Despite everything, Elizabeth found herself smiling back. Yates had always had that effect on her, ever since they were children, and he'd defend her from bullies despite being barely bigger than she was. As they grew, their paths had diverged, she to finishing school back east, he to the hard life of a ranch hand. But whenever they crossed paths, that same easy connection remained. Yates led her to where his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, was tethered. "His name's Thunder. He knows the way to Carson City. I make the trip often enough." He helped her mount, then pressed a small revolver into her hand. "Just in case. The road can be dangerous." Their fingers touched briefly, and Elizabeth felt a jolt that had nothing to do with fear. "Thank you, Yates. I won't forget this." "Go on now," he said, stepping back. "And Elizabeth?" His eyes met hers, intense and earnest. "Find your happiness." With that, she spurred Thunder forward, leaving Willow Creek and her old life behind. The wind whipped at Elizabeth's hair as she rode, the pins working loose until it streamed behind her like a golden banner. The weight that had been crushing her chest for weeks began to lift. With each mile she put between herself and Willow Creek, for the first time in years, she felt free. The landscape rolled by scrubby plains, giving way to rocky foothills. Elizabeth kept Thunder at a steady gallop, mindful of preserving his strength for the long journey. She'd been riding for nearly an hour when she heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats behind her. Panic surged through her veins. Had her father discovered her absence already? She urged Thunder faster, darting off the main trail onto a narrow path that wound through a stand of cottonwoods alongside a creek bed. The hoofbeats grew louder. Her pursuer had followed her detour. Elizabeth's hands tightened on the reins as she navigated the increasingly rough terrain. Thunder was sure-footed but moving at dangerous speed over the uneven ground. A sharp bend in the path appeared ahead, and as she rounded it, the horse stumbled on loose rocks. Elizabeth felt herself flying through the air, then the hard impact as she hit the ground. Pain shot through her ankle, and she cried out, rolling to avoid Thunder's hooves. The loyal horse immediately stopped, circling back to stand protectively near her. Wincing, Elizabeth tried to stand, but her ankle buckled beneath her. The sound of approaching hooves grew louder. She fumbled for the revolver Yates had given her, aiming it toward the bend in the path with shaking hands. A rider appeared, and Elizabeth's finger tensed on the trigger before recognition dawned. "Yates!" He dismounted in one fluid motion, rushing to her side. "Are you hurt?" "My ankle," she managed, lowering the gun. "What are you doing here? Why are you following me?" Yates knelt beside her, gently examining her ankle. "Your father came to the stables looking for you about 15 minutes after you left. When he saw my horse was gone too, he put two and two together and figured we'd run off together." "But we didn't," Elizabeth protested. "No, but it gave me the perfect excuse to come after you." He looked up, his expression serious. "Elizabeth, they're searching every road to Carson City. Horace has offered a $100 reward for your return." He carefully prodded her ankle, causing her to wince. "This isn't broken, but it's a bad sprain. You won't be riding much further today." Despair washed over her. "The train leaves in an hour. It was my only chance." Yates was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There's another way," he finally said. "I know these hills better than anyone. There's an old trail the stagecoaches used to take before the new road was built. It leads to a small settlement called Cooper's Ridge. From there, we can catch the evening train that connects to the main line." "We?" Elizabeth echoed. "I can't very well leave you out here alone, can I?" There was something in his eyes she couldn't quite read. "Besides, your father already thinks we've run off together. Might as well make it true." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat, though she told herself it was just relief at not being abandoned. "Thank you," she said softly. Yates nodded, helping her to her feet. "Can you ride if I help you up?" "I think so," she said, though her ankle throbbed painfully. With gentle strength, Yates lifted her onto Thunder's back, then mounted behind her. Elizabeth was acutely aware of his chest pressed against her back, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. They set off at a slower pace, Yates guiding them deeper into the hills. "Why are you really helping me?" Elizabeth asked, after they had ridden in silence for some time. "You could get in serious trouble." She felt, rather than saw, his shrug. "Maybe I've been looking for an excuse to leave Willow Creek myself." "What about your job at the ranch?" "It was just that, a job. Nothing keeping me there." He guided Thunder around a particularly steep section of trail. "What about you? What's waiting for you in San Francisco?" Elizabeth realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. "Freedom," she said finally. "A chance to make my own choices." "That's a good enough reason," Yates said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They rode deeper into the hills, the trail growing steeper and more challenging. Elizabeth found herself leaning back against Yates for support, grateful for his steady presence. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, she felt safer than she had in years. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Yates guided them into a small clearing sheltered by pines. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, dismounting and helping her down. What about the train? Elizabeth asked anxiously. We've made good time. The settlement is just a few miles ahead, and the train doesn't come through until 9 o'clock. He helped her settle against a fallen log, then began gathering wood for a small fire. As the flames caught and grew, Elizabeth watched Yates move with efficient grace around their makeshift camp. He'd always been like that, capable, self-sufficient. It was one of the things her father had actually respected about him, though he'd never admit it. "You've done this before," she observed. Yates glanced up, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Run away with a bride on her wedding day? Can't say that I have. Made camp in the wilderness," she clarified, laughing despite herself. "More times than I can count." He sat across from her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "I spent 2 years driving cattle up to Montana before settling in Willow Creek." Elizabeth realized how little she really knew about him, despite having known him most of her life. "Why did you come back to Willow Creek? It doesn't seem like the kind of place that would satisfy someone who's seen so much of the country." Something flickered in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. Sometimes a person comes back to a place not because of the place itself, but because of what or who is there. The implication hung in the air between them, and Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. Before she could respond, Yates stood abruptly. "I'll check on the horses," he said, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Elizabeth stared after him, her heart beating a strange rhythm. Had he come back to Willow Creek because of her? The thought seemed preposterous. They had barely spoken more than a few words at a time over the years. And yet, there had always been something there, an unspoken connection that neither of them had acknowledged. When Yates returned, he carried a small bundle from his saddlebag. "It's not much, but it'll keep your strength up," he said, unwrapping jerky and hardtack. He also produced a canteen of water and an unexpected luxury, a small bar of chocolate. "Where did you get chocolate out here?" Elizabeth asked, accepting the treat with delight. "I always carry some. A habit I picked up from my mother. She said chocolate could fix most troubles." His expression softened at the memory. "She passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said. "I didn't know." "No reason you would. It happened while you were away at that fancy school." Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt. "I've been selfish, haven't I? So focused on my own problems that I never thought about what others might be going through." Yates shook his head. "That's not what I meant. We all have our own paths to walk." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "Why didn't you want to marry Horace? Besides the obvious fact that he's old enough to be your grandfather." "He's not quite that old," Elizabeth protested with a small laugh. "But yes, that was part of it. Mostly, though," she searched for the right words, "I want more from life than being a banker's wife, hosting tea parties and charity events until I die. I want to experience things, see places, make my own way." "And what does that look like, making your own way?" Elizabeth had thought about this during the long nights leading up to her wedding. "I'd like to open a school, perhaps. I've always loved teaching. And there are so many places that need good teachers." She looked down, suddenly embarrassed by her ambition. "It sounds foolish, I know." "Not foolish at all," Yates said, his voice warm. "I think you'd make a fine teacher." They talked as the stars came out, sharing stories and dreams. Elizabeth learned that Yates had been saving to buy his own small ranch someday, that he could read and write better than most, because his mother had been a school teacher before marrying his father, that he had a weakness for penny dreadfuls and could play the harmonica. In turn, she told him about her time at finishing school, how she'd secretly read books on history and science while her classmates practiced embroidery, how she missed her mother fiercely, and how she'd once climbed the church steeple on a dare he had made when they were 12. "I can't believe you remember that," Yates laughed. "How could I forget? I tore my best dress and got switched for it." Elizabeth smiled at the memory. "But it was worth it. The view from up there was magnificent." "You were always braver than folks gave you credit for," Yates said, his voice soft. Their eyes met across the fire, and something electric passed between them. Elizabeth felt her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might move closer, but instead, he stood. "We should get going if we want to make that train," he said, kicking dirt over the fire to extinguish it. The moment broken, Elizabeth nodded and allowed him to help her to her feet. Her ankle still hurt, but the rest had helped. As they prepared to leave, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. "Storm's coming," Yates observed, looking up at the clouds now obscuring the stars. "We'd better hurry." They mounted thunder once more, Yates behind Elizabeth, and set off through the darkened forest. The air grew heavy with moisture, and soon fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. Elizabeth shivered as the cold rain soaked through her clothes. "There's a line shack just ahead," Yates shouted over the storm. "We can wait it out there." The small cabin appeared like a miracle in the darkness, a solid shape against the driving rain. Yates dismounted and helped Elizabeth down, then led Thunder to a lean-to-shelter attached to the side of the shack. The door creaked as Yates pushed it open, revealing a sparse but dry interior. "It's not much, but it'll keep us out of the weather," he said, striking a match to light a stub of candle he found on a rough-hewn table. The cabin contained little more than a wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot in the corner. It was dusty but otherwise clean, clearly used occasionally by cowboys working the range. "What about the train?" Elizabeth asked, wringing water from her hair. Yates shook his head. "The tracks run alongside the creek. If this rain keeps up, that section will flood. No train will be running tonight." Disappointment and anxiety warred within her. "They'll be searching for us." "Not in this weather, and not up here," Yates assured her. He busied himself starting a fire in the small stove with wood from a stack by the door. "We'll be safe until morning." As the cabin slowly warmed, Elizabeth became painfully aware of her soaked clothing. She stood awkwardly by the stove, trying to dry herself without removing anything essential. Yates noticed her discomfort and turned away, digging through a trunk in the corner. "Here," he said, holding out a faded flannel shirt without looking at her. "It's probably been here for years, but it's clean and dry. I'll wait outside while you change." "Don't be ridiculous," Elizabeth said quickly. "It's pouring rain. Just turn around." Yates obediently faced the wall while Elizabeth stripped off her wet blouse and donned the flannel shirt, which hung nearly to her knees. "You can turn back now," she said, spreading her wet clothes on a chair near the stove. Yates had removed his own sodden jacket and outer shirt, leaving him in a damp undershirt that clung to his muscular frame. Elizabeth found herself staring before quickly averting her eyes. The awkwardness that had been absent during their fireside conversation now filled the small space. They were alone, miles from civilization, in a situation that would ruin Elizabeth's reputation forever if it became known. Yet, strangely, she felt no fear, only a growing awareness of the man standing just a few feet away. "You should take the cot," Yates said, breaking the silence. "I'll be fine on the floor." "Thank you," Elizabeth said softly. Outside, the storm raged, rain pounding against the roof and wind howling through the trees. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing in Elizabeth's heart. As she settled onto the cot, she found herself wondering what might have happened if she'd noticed Yates really noticed him before now. "Yates?" she asked into the darkness. "What did you mean earlier about coming back to Willow Creek because of who was there?" For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain. Then his voice came, low and honest. "I think you know." Elizabeth's heart quickened. "Tell me anyway." She heard him shift on the floor, and then his voice was closer, as if he'd sat up. "I came back because of you, Elizabeth. It's always been you." The confession hung in the air, weightier than the storm clouds outside. "But you never said anything," she whispered. "What was I supposed to say? You're the banker's daughter. I'm just a cowhand. Your father would have run me out of town if I'd so much as looked at you wrong. So instead, you watched me nearly marry someone else?" The thought filled her with a strange mixture of indignation and hope. "I was planning to leave again after the wedding," Yates admitted. "I couldn't stay and watch you with him. But then you ran, and suddenly there you were, looking like freedom itself, asking for my help." Elizabeth sat up, straining to see his face in the dim light from the stove's glow. "How long have you felt this way?" "Since we were 16 and you came back from your first year at that school. You wore a blue dress to the Founders' Day dance, and when you smiled at me, I knew I was in trouble. 5 years. He had carried this for 5 years while she remained oblivious, focused on her own discontent. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. "Would it have mattered?" His voice was gentle but edged with old pain, You were destined for someone like Horace, someone with position, money, prospects. What could I offer you? Elizabeth found herself moving, sliding from the cot to kneel on the floor beside him. In the faint light, she could just make out the contours of his face, the surprise in his eyes as she reached out to touch his cheek. You could have offered me a choice, she whispered. That's all I've ever wanted. The air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. For a suspended moment, neither moved. Then, with infinite gentleness, Yates leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a demand. When Elizabeth responded, wrapping her arms around his neck and drawing him closer, the question was answered. The kiss deepened, years of unspoken longing pouring into this one perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Yates pressed his forehead to hers. If this is a dream, he murmured, I don't want to wake up. Elizabeth laughed softly, feeling lightheaded with joy and the newness of it all. It's not a dream, though I'm not sure what it is. It's a beginning, Yates said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. If you want it to be. I do, she whispered, the irony of those words, the ones she'd nearly spoken at a very different ceremony that day, not lost on her. But what happens now? My father will never accept this. We'll figure it out, Yates promised. Together. They talked long into the night, making plans and sharing kisses. The storm outside gradually subsiding as the storm within their hearts resolved into perfect clarity. At some point, Elizabeth drifted to sleep in Yates's arms, feeling safer and more at peace than she had in years. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the scent of coffee brewing on the stove. Yates stood by the window, looking out at the world washed clean by the night's storm. Morning, he said, turning to her with a smile that made her heart flip. Sleep well? Better than I have in months, she admitted, stretching. The reality of their situation came rushing back, tempering her happiness with anxiety. What time is it? Just after dawn. The creek's running high, but we should be able to make it to Cooper's Ridge by midday if we leave soon. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. The question is, where do we go from there? Elizabeth sipped the strong brew, considering. I still want to go west. There are more opportunities there for both of us. She looked up at him uncertainly. That is, if you still want to come with me. Yates knelt beside her, taking her free hand in his. Elizabeth, I would follow you to the ends of the earth if you asked me to. But are you sure this is what you want? It won't be easy. We'll be starting with almost nothing. I've never been more sure of anything, she said firmly. I don't need fancy dresses or dinner parties. I just need... She paused, suddenly shy. What do you need? Yates prompted softly. You, she finished simply. I need you. The kiss they shared then was a promise, sealing their commitment to this new, uncertain path they'd chosen together. They left the cabin an hour later, Elizabeth wearing her now dry clothes and carrying the memory of that night like a talisman. The world sparkled around them, droplets of rain clinging to leaves and grass, the sky washed to a perfect blue. They rode double again, but the dynamic had shifted. Elizabeth leaned back against Yates's chest without hesitation, and his arm around her waist felt like it belonged there. They talked and laughed, making plans for their future as thunder carried them steadily toward Cooper's Ridge. The small settlement appeared before them just as the sun reached its zenith, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a valley between pine-covered hills. To Elizabeth's relief, the station master confirmed that the evening train was still scheduled to arrive, though it would be running late due to track repairs after the storm. That gives us time to prepare, Yates said as they left the station. We should get you some suitable traveling clothes and supplies for the journey. The general store yielded a simple traveling dress, a warm shawl, and basic necessities. Elizabeth changed in a back room while Yates purchased food for the journey. When she emerged, he stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. You look beautiful, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Elizabeth blushed, smoothing the plain blue fabric. It's nothing special. It's you, Yates replied simply. That makes it special. They spent the afternoon in the small settlement, always watchful for any sign of pursuit from Willow Creek, but the roads remained quiet. As evening approached, they made their way back to the station, where a handful of other passengers waited for the delayed train. "I just realized," Elizabeth said as they sat on a bench on the platform, "I don't even know where we're going." Yates grinned. "I bought tickets to Sacramento. From there, we can decide our next move." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. "I've been saving for years for my ranch. It's not much, but it's enough to get us started wherever we end up." Elizabeth was touched by his willingness to spend his life savings on their escape. "We'll build something wonderful together," she promised. "A home, a future." The distant whistle of the approaching train cut through the evening air. Elizabeth felt a surge of both excitement and fear. This was it, the point of no return. She would be leaving behind everything she had ever known for an uncertain future with a man she was only beginning to truly know. As if sensing her thoughts, Yates squeezed her hand. "It's not too late to change your mind," he said quietly. "I would understand." Elizabeth looked up at him, at the face that had somehow always been there in the background of her life, now suddenly at its center. "I don't want to change my mind," she said firmly. "This is my choice. You are my choice." The train rumbled into the station, steam billowing around it like the clouds of uncertainty surrounding their future. As they stood to board, a commotion at the far end of the platform caught Elizabeth's attention. Her heart nearly stopped as she recognized the figures pushing through the small crowd, her father and Horace Pemberton, along with the sheriff from Willow Creek. "Yates," she breathed, clutching his arm in panic. He followed her gaze, his body tensing as he spotted the search party. "Stay behind me," he said, positioning himself protectively in front of her. It was too late to run, they'd been spotted. Her father's face was a thundercloud of rage as he strode toward them, Horace and the sheriff close behind. "Elizabeth," her father bellowed, "what is the meaning of this? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Passengers stared as the confrontation unfolded on the platform. Elizabeth felt herself shrinking under their curious gazes, but Yates remained solid beside her. "Mr. Anderson," Yates said, his voice calm but firm, "your daughter has made her choice." "Her choice?" Horace sputtered, his jowls quivering with indignation. "She's barely more than a child. She doesn't know what she wants." "I am 20 years old," Elizabeth said, finding her voice as she stepped out from behind Yates. "I am not a child, and I know exactly what I want. And it isn't a loveless marriage to a man who sees me as nothing more than a pretty ornament for his home." Her father's face reddened. "You ungrateful girl. After everything I've done for you. What have you done, Father? Arranged my life without consulting me. Traded me like cattle to secure a business deal?" The words poured out, years of resentment finally finding voice. Mother would never have allowed this. The mention of her mother struck her father like a physical blow. He took a step back, some of the anger leaving his face, replaced by a hurt that made Elizabeth's heart ache despite everything. "You have disgraced this family," he said, but the fire had gone from his voice. "You have embarrassed Horace in front of the entire town." "I'm sorry for the embarrassment," Elizabeth said sincerely, "but I won't apologize for refusing to sacrifice my life for your business interests." The sheriff, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Mr. Young, you're wanted for horse theft and abduction." "That's ridiculous," Elizabeth protested. "I went willingly, and the horse belongs to Yates." "Nevertheless," the sheriff said, reaching for his handcuffs, "I have a duty to bring you both back to Willow Creek to sort this out." The train whistle blew again, a final boarding call. Elizabeth felt desperation rising. They were so close to freedom. "Sheriff," Yates said, his voice steady, "I understand you're doing your job, but I'd like to propose an alternative." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather pouch. "There's $200 here. It's everything I have. I'll give it to Mr. Pemberton as compensation for the embarrassment, if you'll let us go." Horace scoffed. "Do you really think money can—" "300, Elizabeth's father interrupted, surprising everyone. He reached into his own pocket and added a sum to Yates's offering, holding it out to Horace. "For your trouble and discretion in this matter." Horace stared at the money, then at Elizabeth's father. "Thomas, you can't be serious." "After what they've done?" For the first time, Elizabeth's father really looked at her not as a disobedient daughter, but as a woman standing her ground. Something shifted in his expression. "My wife would have had my hide for what I tried to do to our daughter," he said quietly. "Perhaps Elizabeth is right about that, at least." The revelation stunned Elizabeth into silence. Her father turned to her, his expression softening further. "Is this truly what you want?" he asked. "To leave everything behind for him?" He gestured toward Yates with a mixture of resignation and distaste. Elizabeth nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "Yes. Father, I love him." The words came easily, naturally, though she had never said them aloud before. Beside her, she felt Yates's hand tighten around hers. Her father sighed deeply. "Then go. But know this, you will always have a home to return to, should you need it." It was more than Elizabeth had dared hope for. She stepped forward and embraced her father briefly. "Thank you," she whispered. Horace sputtered protests, but the sheriff, witnessing what appeared to be a family resolution, merely shrugged and put away his handcuffs. "No charges, no arrest," he said simply. The train whistle blew once more, an impatient reminder that time was running short. Elizabeth looked back at her father, memorizing his face, knowing it might be years before she saw him again. "Be happy," he said gruffly. "Your mother would want that." With a final nod, Elizabeth turned and boarded the train with Yates, their path to the future suddenly, unexpectedly clear. As the train pulled away from Cooper's Ridge, Elizabeth watched her father's figure grow smaller until it disappeared entirely. A chapter of her life was closing, but a new one was just beginning. "I meant what I said," she told Yates as they settled into their seats. "I do love you." His smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "And I've loved you for longer than you know." The train carried them west, toward Sacramento and beyond, toward a future they would build together. Elizabeth rested her head on Yates's shoulder, exhaustion and excitement mingling as the events of the past 2 days caught up with her. She had run from a wedding she didn't want, only to find the love she'd always yearned for. "Sleep," Yates murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll be right here when you wake up." And for the first time in her life, Elizabeth felt truly, completely free. 3 months later, under the towering redwoods of Northern California, Elizabeth Anderson became Elizabeth Young in a small ceremony attended by the friends they'd made in their new home of Redwood Valley. Her father had sent a letter of reconciliation, along with a generous wedding gift, which they had used to purchase a small plot of land, with a cabin that reminded them both of the storm-swept night when they had first acknowledged their feelings. Elizabeth had found a position teaching at the local school, while Yates worked at a logging camp, saving to transform their modest property into the ranch he'd always dreamed of owning. Their life was not luxurious, but it was rich in ways that mattered, filled with hard work, mutual respect, and a love that deepened with each passing day. On their wedding night, as they stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, Yates pulled Elizabeth close and whispered in her ear, "Remember when I caught your hand that day you were running away?" Elizabeth nodded, smiling at the memory that now seemed so distant. "I knew then what I couldn't say," Yates continued, turning her to face him. "It wasn't just that you were running away from something. You were running to something too." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch still sending shivers through her after all this time. "It's me you've been running to, Elizabeth, all this time." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her true home, not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had loved her enough to let her choose her own path and brave enough to walk it with her. They stood together on the threshold of their future, the past behind them, the winding road ahead stretching into a shared horizon full of promise, challenge, and abiding love. 20 years later, Elizabeth sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching her 3 children help their father with the evening chores. Their eldest, Thomas, named for her father, was nearly 18 now, and the spitting image of Yates. The twins, Sarah and Samuel, 13 and full of mischief, raced each other to complete their tasks. The small ranch had prospered over the years, as had the town of Redwood Valley. Elizabeth's one-room schoolhouse had grown into a proper school building where she still taught, now as the head mistress. Yates had expanded their holdings bit by bit, until they had one of the most respected small cattle operations in the county. Her father had come to visit many times before his passing 5 years ago, eventually developing a grudging respect for Yates and adoring his grandchildren. Horace Pemberton had married a widow from Sacramento the year after Elizabeth's flight and, by all accounts, seemed content with his choice. As twilight settled over the valley, Yates joined Elizabeth on the porch, his hair now streaked with silver, but his blue eyes still as vibrant as the day he'd helped her escape. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her and taking her hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," Elizabeth replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run away that day?" Yates was quiet for a moment, contemplating. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens," he said finally. "But I know this, I would have found my way to you somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of the frightened young woman she'd been, fleeing from a future that felt like a cage. That desperate flight had led her not just to freedom, but to the deepest love she could have imagined. "Remember what you said on our wedding night?" she asked, "about me running to you all along?" Yates nodded, bringing her hand to his lips. "Best thing I ever did, catching you that day." Their children's laughter floated across the yard as the first stars appeared in the evening sky. Elizabeth Young, once a runaway bride, now a wife, mother, teacher, and pioneer in her own right, squeezed her husband's hand and knew with absolute certainty that she had never stopped running toward him, and that together they had built a life worth running to.